Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Prairie Podcast. My name is Andrew Weeb, and it's a pleasure to have you join us today. We've got a wonderful guest with us, Isaac, and I think he's got some interesting stuff for us to say, or for us to hear. He's going to say. So, no matter who you are, whether you're a parent of a student yourself, community member, alumni, friend of the college, or you found us by accident, welcome here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Isaac. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us a bit about who you are, and then we're going to talk about an interesting topic, I think.
Yeah, my name is Isaac Froese, and I'm in my fourth year of the Outdoor Leadership Program. Yeah, just about to graduate here. It's pretty cool. And yeah, through my time at Prairie, definitely focused on really experiential elements of education, being in the outdoors, using the process of reflection to learn from our experiences, and it's been a big impact on how I've approached other classes, including Bible classes, theology classes, which kind of influenced my paper we're going to discuss here.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Isaac. And that's exactly it. We're continuing along in this kind of mini series here as we're looking at uh, essays and topics that some of our fourth year students have been working on, give them a space to discuss it. And I think there's a lot that we can actually learn from you guys as well. And today's topic that Isaac, you've written about is, if I believe correct, the theology of celebration. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. And that's an interesting one. Um, when I first heard about it, I was like, "This, I gotta pick your brain about this. That sounds cool." The theology of partying. I don't know. So I'm curious. Give us a bit of a framework, maybe a bit of a background on first off, kind of what the general theme of your paper is about, but then also maybe how you got to this topic and what your interest is in covering it.
Yeah, so like the foundational claim of my paper is that celebration is really important for both memory and hope, and that's how we should engage with it as Christians. And then the reason I wanted to write on this paper, or write this paper, was because my experience with celebrations is kind of like a confusing mess. Like, well, what are celebrations for? Because often you'll
Mm.
hear about Christmas, and people are like, oh, we gotta make sure we celebrate the true meaning of Christmas. It's like, well, do the gifts and the carols and all these things not communicate the true meaning of Christmas? So we have to make careful we don't lose it. And then other things like my favorite celebrations nobody else knows about because my family just has like some strange things we could do. Like my favorite things are two: shearing and butchering. Most people have no idea what those are, but my family raises alpacas, and so once a year we get together as a family and we shear our alpacas, and like that's always like a big
Big
party
party, yeah.
because we just get together, eat good food, shear our animals, and then for butchering we yeah, make our own sausage that year for the year, and like those are my favorite celebrations. I'm like, well, why do these ones resonate with me more than all like these other things like Christmas and Easter, Thanksgiving,
Hmm.
etc. So I was like, well, what's different about these? So that's why I wanted to look into it.
That's fascinating. That's an interesting context, and you know, I think you bring up a good question of holidays, especially like Christmas, where you talk about trying to get back to the true meaning of Christmas, which is about Jesus, right? But then, therefore, does that mean all these extra things? The gift giving, the feasts, the stories, the gatherings, all these types of things that they're not true. They're
Hmm.
not true enough, or it's interesting, and I think you address a lot of this in your paper. And how do we tie this all together? Kind of the first area I wanted to go with you is to talk about the different types of celebrations. I think you kind of broke your paper down into kind of celebrations that are not like the non-biblical perspective of celebration and parties, and then kind of what are some of the biblical themes that we find about celebrations. So, starting with kind of the non-biblical ones, you just to give us some context. You mentioned something like raves or VIP parties. I'm curious if you could share about some of those a little bit.
Yeah, so I started with the really extreme examples.
Yeah.
Most people don't go to raves. Most people don't go to these VIP parties, but they're really extreme, and so they really emphasize one aspect of what celebration looks like in our secular culture. And so with the rave, it's lots of drug culture, lots of dissociation.
Yes.
So yeah, there's lots of dissociation and drug use in raves. So it's like that really extreme example of what happens at lots of parties in the secular world.
Mhm.
And then in the VIP world, it's this extreme use of wealth and power in ways that most people can't do, but not that they wouldn't do it. And
Yep.
so it's like this celebration of power and wealth and this really interesting message that they've earned it. It's like if I want to give a Christianese language label to it, it's like a gospel of works at the
Hmm.
VIP party.
At the VIP party. I think that was interesting that you brought up the idea that there is religious tones in these types of parties, right? the rave. I think you mentioned something about grace. I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Oh yes, yeah, that's a good point. So at the rave, they're looking forward to this hope or this grace of being dissociated and removed from the pain of their current existence.
Hmm.
And this is really counter the Christian message where we get hope from looking forward at the promises of God and the work He's done in our past, not by just dissociating and removing ourselves from the pain we're currently in.
That's an interesting concept, isn't it?
Hmm.
And like you said, I think those extreme examples kind of, most people generally won't go to a rave per se or be a part of a VIP party, but they can kind of show the human nature, right? The
Hmm.
desire to disassociate from our pain and from the hurts of life, but also the other side where we want to show our power, our wealth. We want to experience that we've earned it, that it's all about us, right?
Hmm.
And to display that and to give that, which is interesting. But you also talk about kind of
Hmm.
the ordinary celebration of the weekend, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious what your thoughts were on that as you looked into it.
Yeah. Then I contrasted weekend partying with Sabbath. And
Mm,
so weekend partying is really common in our culture. Like growing up in high school, I knew tons of people. I heard lots of stories who partied on the weekend, like binge drinking, and that's a really normalized part of our culture. And so it's like this is a good kind of middle ground after the VIP and the rave because not many people do those things
yeah.
in modern context. So with this weekend partying, I used a song as like showing this kind of cultural expectation of what a party is, where it's like this high levels of drinking. And the main idea is you're escaping the work week and you're doing that through forgetfulness,
Hmm.
which, again, contrasting biblical narrative where in the Sabbath, you rest from your work week and you like put aside the worries of the work week to rest in the provision of God. Whereas in party culture, you on Saturday, you just take a bunch of drinks and you forget the work week
Hmm.
and you just take the consequences later.
Yeah.
And so it's very different.
It is. And I thought that was interesting the way you approach that um, the kind of the weekend, kind of the secular Sabbath, I think, as you mentioned it. It very much is this idea, once again, of disassociating, forgetting that the celebration and the party is more about trying to escape, just so you have a little break, you have a little escape to get away before you have
Mhm.
to dive back in and take responsibility again. Which is where interesting, I think you take this shift and that the biblical understanding of Sabbath is that you're supposed to rest in order to be filled up, in order that you can go
Mhm.
back into it, right? That
Mhm.
there's a different idea behind the value and the point of the party and celebration. But I want you to explain that further, kind of your understanding. So let's turn to the biblical examples that you looked into. I know you started with the Torah, which I think laid a foundation for a lot of what you were going to talk about. So I'm curious if you have some examples you recall from your study in the Torah there.
Mhm. Yeah. So in the Torah, there's several passages that outline kind of the liturgical calendar, if you want to call it that, of Israel. So every week you have a Sabbath.
Hmm.
And then in the spring, you have a cluster of celebrations. And in the fall, you have a cluster of celebrations. So in total, you have the Sabbath and then seven other celebrations.
Okay.
One of them in the fall is like a solemn day. So it's not really a celebration, it's like the Day of Atonement.
Yes. Yeah.
The rest are all celebrations. So it's
Yeah.
a ratio there that I'm not sure how I didn't delve into that, but most of it's celebrating, and most of them are kind of connected to that harvest rhythm of the agricultural world back then.
Certainly. I think you mentioned like Feast of Tabernacles a little bit.
Yeah, that was like my case study I used the
Okay.
most because it's like the biggest party.
Okay.
So in the fall, after you've harvested all of your produce, so the wheat, the barley, all the summer fruits, you've shorn your sheep, everything's come in for the year.
Yeah.
There's no more to harvest. Then you have a 7 week or seven, not 7 week, 7 day party.
Hmm.
So everyone has to go to Jerusalem for this event. All the men go, and then their families would go with them.
Yeah.
And then in that, they also bring their tithe for the year. And what they do is really interesting. The tithe is like a 3 year rotation. 2 years, you bring it to Jerusalem and you have a party. In the third year, you give it to the Levites. And
Interesting.
so it's like you come after harvesting all of this to recognize not only your people, like Israel, all gets together. So like kind of
Mhm.
identifies them as Israel. And also you're using your wealth to reflect on the goodness of God.
Hmm. And I think that was a really key statement I noticed was that it's that the celebrations oftentimes, um, it's about reflecting on the goodness of God, um, which I think was which was interesting because the secular kind of partying is a lot about the self, right?
Hmm.
And escapism and forgetfulness and wealth and power and all of that. But what we're starting to see here is that the celebration is to rest, but it's also to reflect on the goodness of God and His character.
Hmm.
I'm curious, as you worked through the historical books, prophets, were there some other themes that you recall that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, I'm in the Torah still.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah,
Lots of
that,
these celebrations have really embodied things you do.
okay.
So like our celebrations, we give gifts, we eat food, but then they do this kind of same thing, and also they have a couple more. Like at the Feast of Tabernacles, they live in a temporary shelter for a week.
Yeah.
Like they make a little hut out of sticks and like have a party while they're living in this temporary shelter to remind themselves of the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land.
Hmm.
And so that theme of doing something that's physical as
Yeah.
well as just mentally remembering is really important, and that shows up throughout um, the rest of the books of the Bible.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting. So that was a really key thing for you to kind of notice was that tangibility of like you're doing something,
yeah,
but then tying into the acts of God.
hmm,
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay. That's fascinating. So you observe that through the rest of the scripture, and then the New Testament. Um, I mean, Jesus. You recall there's multiple stories where he's feasting. I remember reading this book, or I didn't read it. I just saw the title, um, and I referenced it a little bit in a different project I was working on, and it was something about like eating your way through Luke. For example, and just talked about every single feast that Jesus attended. So I'm curious, maybe tying back into some of the stuff you'd learned of the Torah, but
Mhm.
yeah, what did we see about Jesus?
Jesus kind of really builds off of what the prophets do with the festivals, because I mentioned in Zechariah, I think
Mm,
yeah, Zechariah,
yeah.
it talks about the Feast of Tabernacles. It's like all the nations coming to Jerusalem for this
Mm,
pilgrimage feast, and then in the work of Christ, you see him kind of taking these festivals from the Torah that were originally outlined in the Torah and reinterpreting them for us in light of himself and the work he's done. And that's really cool that you can like reflect on not only all the salvation history, all the way from Egypt,
mm,
all the way through Christ and beyond into the new creation. I think that's a really neat element
yeah.
of the New Testament brings to us that makes it really clear.
Yep.
And also you just see Jesus interacting with all these different celebrations in a really positive way. Like he's willing to have fun and feast and to enjoy things. Like look at the wedding of Cana,
Yep.
where he provides hundreds of gallons of wine.
Yep.
If he was a killjoy and not into celebrating, he probably wouldn't have done that. And it's like John even notes, like this is the first miracle by which he showed his glory,
Hmm.
and that's what he says in the book of John, in John 2.
Yeah.
Just
Exactly.
very interesting things to reflect on.
That is interesting to reflect on. That's a cool point you make there about how these feasts, over time, we start to associate more and more things with them, and you can remember the different acts of God through the ages, and the New
Hmm.
Testament gives us that perspective as they can look back on it. Like I feel like I recall even the Feast of Tabernacles even gets associated with the Maccabean. I think there's some Maccabean
Yeah,
concepts that
I'm
get
not
tied
sure
into
about
it.
that, but yeah, I think
I,
I've heard of
I
that
I feel
too.
like I recall that there's something tied in, but you can see like throughout history, you can add in these different aspects into the festivals. It can really build up. They just keep growing. That's
Hmm.
really awesome. And it was interesting, like you talked about with Jesus. He actually really liked to party. He liked to feast. He liked to be with friends and eat food and just
Hmm.
encourage them and talk with them and hear about them. I don't know if it's a relevant quote, but as you talked about the feast in Cana, the wedding in Cana was the first miracle he performed. Reminded me of a quote my wife said to me a while ago. Was that um, playing earns you the right to be heard, or something like that. But maybe in a similar concept that Jesus, what he wasn't trying to stay away from people. He was actually by engaging into the people's world.
Hmm.
He earned the right to be heard. They were willing to listen to him because he actually was a part of their life.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
that interacts like really interesting with the church. Like we have to be able to willing to engage with culture in these ways. We don't have to approve of everything that happens in celebrations and parties, but we have to be willing to engage with that. And then that made it interesting because like you asked like the wedding at Cana, you ended up with this really interesting. Like, well, what about substance use in parties? Because that can be really really bad. But
Mm-hmm.
is there some context where it's good? And so you have to like I didn't really give you an answer in my paper. I just
Yeah.
kind of developed like we need to actually think about this and engage with this seriously because it's an important question because we have to be able to engage with culture. Like you
Yeah.
said, if you play, you earn that right to be heard.
Yeah.
So if you disconnect completely as a church from the greater culture of celebration,
Yeah.
you're really just hamstringing yourself as a um, from
Yeah.
your witness.
Exactly. And I think that's a really key distinction that you're trying to make is that we don't jump into culture all the way. We don't just accept everything, but recognizing is it better to almost be the tree in a flood that learns to bend a little bit so you don't get swept away completely?
Hmm.
I don't know. Like you said, you don't come up with a full answer because you want us to think about it.
Yeah.
And I think that encourages us listeners to think about it, to do something about it, to mull over it, and to come up with a choice,
Hmm.
right? And that choice could look a little different depending on your context and your cultural context. I know you also mentioned a lot about the Passover, right?
Hmm.
And then tying that into the Lord's Supper too a little bit. I'm curious what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, that's like the biggest continuity you get between New Testament, Old Testament celebrations is Passover and the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
So the Passover tells like the salvation of Israel from Egypt. So God delivers them. He takes them through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, and so you have this mighty, mighty act of salvation on Israel's behalf. And then Jesus, his death is appropriated right into that tradition. So
Yeah.
the story is just one continuous story, right from Exodus, where he's taking them out of Egypt, to where he's dying on the cross as the Passover lamb for us.
Mm.
And so in the Lord's Supper, we're remembering that same story in a different way. And Easter, it's historically been disconnected from Passover because there's a lot of anti Semitic tendencies in
Mm.
like medieval church.
Yeah.
So they really wanted to disconnect it from Passover, but it's really the same story being told through those two.
Yeah.
And so every time you take the Lord's Supper, you can reflect on the Passover. And I
Mm.
referenced the Book of Common Prayer from the Anglican tradition, and they make this connection explicit by citing a certain verse from Corinthians and saying, "Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast." And then they
Mm.
take communion,
Yeah.
like take the bread and the wine.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important idea to connect because then you have a remembrance, like I mentioned, like celebrations, but remembering and hope. You
Yeah.
remember all the work that Christ has done and all the work that God has done for his people throughout history.
Yeah.
And then you also look forward to all the promises he made. Because when he took the cup and the wine at the Last Supper, he said, "I'll not eat of this until it's fulfilled in my kingdom."
Yeah.
And then he also like, "Do this in remembrance of me." And he's like promising something more as well as saying, "Don't forget what I've already done."
Mm. I think that's a really key theme. Once again, that celebration is about remembering God's goodness. I think you mentioned gives us hope, and what was the other one?
Yeah, so there's hope in looking forward, and then yeah, all that memory of
The
like
memory, yeah.
remembering the work he's done and the blessings he's given us.
Yep. So that's exactly it. Gives us the hope and the memory. I think that's really valuable.
Hmm.
That's really cool to see. And the Lord's Supper now today, something we can still do to recall that. I think you had an interesting um, comment about how a lot of churches, at least within our kind of proximity, our cultural area, whatever you want to call it, uh, it we don't exactly feast when we do the Lord's Supper. It's not exactly a whole big celebration.
Hmm.
But you also mentioned that our structure doesn't really allow that to happen. And so I'm be curious kind of what if you're probing into it, maybe you also have a potential idea on solutions or ways to maybe encourage or change a direction. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mentioned that we have like a couple grams of bread, a few milliliters of juice or wine, and that's our feast, right?
Hmm.
And so, well, what can we do to really embrace the whole celebration? I was thinking it doesn't work in a normal church service to just sit down and have a full meal with the whole congregation. But in my church context, I've grown up having potlucks and meals all the time at church. So we have a way of doing it. If we just incorporate the Lord's Supper into those celebrations of like church community, that'd be very appropriate. And you could then frame the whole meal as part of that Lord's Supper with
Mm.
that juice or that wine and that bread. and welcome the whole church community into this table fellowship,
Yeah.
which is anchored in memory and hope.
Yeah.
And I think thinking you also do this around certain feasts we already have, like in the church calendar, we have Easter, we have Christmas, we have a whole bunch more if you come from more high church or liturgical backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so all these are like great opportunities to take the time to maybe change the service order a bit more and have a meal together. Like often we have a meal anyway after the service, so why not make the service and the meal one thing to help us really embrace that embodied practice of remembering and hoping for the goodness of God.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful, Isaac. I really appreciate your kind of research, your comments, your thoughts as you've dug into this, as you shared it, you wrote your paper and presented it, and now you're graduating and you've got these thoughts, and you're gonna go out and see where the Lord leads you with that. Before we wrap up, I'm curious, Dave, any final thoughts, anything you kind of want to tie this all together with, any conclusions you have for us?
Hmm. Yeah, earlier in the paper, I mentioned this one passage from Deuteronomy 8, where it connects uh, forgetfulness and disobedience,
Hmm.
and it associates increase of wealth. Like it says, once you go into the land and you get all this increase from the blessings I'm giving you, you're going to forget.
Yeah.
And that can be a warning for us here in North America, because we have that increase. So we've been blessed abundantly. So we can use our celebrations to appropriately use that wealth to remember.
Hmm.
I think that's a really important step we could take as Christians in a context like North America.
Yeah.
And
That's
then,
sir, continue.
yeah, and also, I only wrote half the paper, really.
Yeah.
'Cause on the other side of the paper, there's these seasons of preparation and fasting and different kind of remembrance, which are important as well.
Yeah.
So obviously, I couldn't cover it all in one paper. That's why I just focus on celebration this time. But
Yeah.
if I were to write a part 2, I'd write it on fasting and solemn days.
Yeah.
And so it's important to like look at both of these and remember that we can use what God's given us to remember Him and His work, and that will steer us and our memory towards God and steer us towards obedience.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Isaac. I'm curious. I know most people likely won't have a space to read your paper.
Yeah.
So, in your study, did you find any helpful resources that you could recommend to people if they want to dig deeper into this?
Yeah, so I didn't really find a ton of resources that answered the question I was looking at. So
Okay.
I kind of had to synthesize a whole bunch of different things.
Okay.
And so, yeah, in our library, we had these couple books. They're like Feasts of the New Testament or Feasts of Jesus and the Feast of Paul, where actually like a cookbook combined with biblical theology and
Interesting.
yeah, really interesting work. I don't remember the exact title. It's in my bibliography, but
Okay.
you can maybe like put it in the description or something. Yeah.
Certainly. So I guess everybody look for feast recipe books.
Yeah, like they tell you like this is how they celebrated this in the New Testament. Here you can try it out. And it's pretty fun. Like you could make that work if you wanted to do another resource. And
That's interesting. Cool. Well, once again, thank you so much, Isaac, for sharing. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you learned something new. I think I did myself. And hopefully, you've been challenged too to think and consider celebrating, partying, feasting, hope, remembrance, all these wonderful themes that you brought up. Of course, if you guys want to listen to some previous episodes, you can do that as well. You can also head to our website, www.prairie.edu, if you want to learn about outdoor leadership or some of the other fun programs we got going on here. And, if you show up in 4 years, maybe you can write your own paper on a topic of your choice. So thank you so much. And thank you, Isaac.